So, at any rate, I think we are close enough. So, this is video games without video games. I'm not sure if this is a good title for this panel because it's like very weird and enigmatic, and it makes sense to me, and I think it makes sense once you read the description for it. But today, what we are going to be talking about is this. With every year and every new generation of video game hardware, we move further and further towards an all-digital future where physical games no longer exist and neither does ownership. In 2023, the Video Game History Foundation found that the overwhelming majority of video games published in the past 50 years are unavailable in the marketplace. While a significant portion are still available secondhand, many are cost-prohibitive and dependent on rapidly aging hardware. Join us for an examination of digital consumer rights, legal exceptions, abandonware, the legal and moral implications of both emulation and homebrew, and how we as consumers can proactively support classic franchises and ongoing preservation efforts. So, before we continue, I want to be very clear. While we will touch on both piracy and emulation a little bit, this panel is not pro-piracy, nor is it a how-to for emulation. So, in a kind of like MAGFesty way, I want to start with like a weird deep cut, okay? And then we're going to get a little more serious as we kind of go along. Just bear with me, all right? I want to start with this article from 2012, published on the now defunct Penny Arcade Report by veteran game journalist Ben Kuchera. Now, I don't know how culturally relevant Penny Arcade is these days, but for anyone not familiar with the long-running webcomic, they'd never been known for their journalistic integrity. And I used to be like a really big fan of Penny Arcade, but the interest in webcomics just kind of faded for me. Regardless, this article has lived in my head rent-free over the years. Because despite having some fairly rational arguments, it has wound up aging somewhat poorly. So he begins by stating, the rumor of a digital-only console refuses to die, and continues with, these rumors are bullshit. The world is not ready for an all-digital console. His main points were as follows. The slow rate of broadband adoption. It excludes those who aren't or don't want to be connected. The cost of physical storage over optical media, hard drives versus disks. Retailers refusing to support a digital-only product. That players won't be able to borrow or resell their games. And then ISPs imposing data fees, caps, and bandwidth throttling. He closes out the article by saying, it won't happen because it doesn't need to happen. Digital delivery is going to become a more popular option next generation, but that's what it will be, an option. No one is stupid enough to require it. To be fair, we have yet to see an exclusively digital platform from a major console manufacturer. However, in 2019, 7 years after Kuchera's article, we did get the first major all-digital console. The Xbox One S All-Digital Edition. We all ridiculed and joked about it at the time, calling it the Xbox One Sad Edition, but in retrospect, it was just a taste of things to come. Because the following year in 2020, the PS5 and Xbox Series both launched with all-digital versions. This leaves Nintendo as the only major player to not offer a digital-only version. However, being as how the Switch platform is built around a handheld, it exists in a somewhat different paradigm. But wait, there's more. Let's back it up for just a second because I said major console manufacturer. Kuchera's article was published March 15th, 2012. Since then, we have gotten the following all-digital consoles. The Ouya. It was launched on Kickstarter 4 months later, or it was unveiled on 4 months later on July 10th, 2012. So 4 months after the article he wrote, it was unveiled. And we laugh about it now, but the Ouya was one of the most successfully funded Kickstarter products at the time. It was dead on arrival, but it really excited people to have a tiny little set-top like Android box by like an underdog as opposed to a Microsoft or a Sony and so forth. But moving right along, the Amazon Fire TV. You can play games on the Amazon Fire TV. The NVIDIA Shield, Apple TV, the Valve Steam Machine, and last but not least, Google Stadia. You know, the success of these things is a little bit variable, but you've got all these other platforms that have come out, you know, over the years that you can play games digitally on. But wait, there's even more. Those are just the digital consoles that have come out since this article's publication. Also, let's just pause for a second, and I have to acknowledge that at this point, this is less about me being nitpicky and more about like the deep dive into the progression of digital-only consoles. So far, we've only talked about what's come out since this article. We have yet to talk about before. Digital games came to the Roku platform with the release of the Roku 2 all the way back in 2011. And we also had the all-digital version of the PSP Go in 2009. And finally, we have what might be the very first all-digital video game platform, the Zeebo. I'm glad that there's enough of you that really understand where we're going with this. The Zeebo was released all the way back in 2009, and if you don't know what it was primarily like a Brazil market set-top console box that was a cellularly enabled, digitally only game console that operated as a subscription that they basically released games on a regular basis on. So if you don't know anything about this ambitious dumpster fire of a game console, my all-time favorite YouTube channel is Stop Skeletons from Fighting, and they have covered this console at length. I highly recommend going down this rabbit hole with them. Also, like we were talking, while not a console, the PC platform has, for all intents and purposes, been digital only for quite some time. Retail availability of physical PC games began declining around 2005, and they have effectively been absent from the marketplace as far back as 2010. And last but certainly not least, while not what we think of as a game console, you just can't ignore their impact on the global game ecosystem. Digital games launched on both Apple iPhone and Android phones in 2008. The first game available on iPhone was Imangi, the developers of which would later go on to release the successful Temple Run series. And on Android, the first game released was a little-known game called Angry Birds. So, Sony, Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon, NVIDIA, Valve, all of these major multi-billion dollar technology companies have been publishing digital-only devices and platforms for the past 15 years. And it makes a lot of sense from both a logistical and financial perspective. So what's the problem with all of this? What is the problem with digital consoles? We have all these modern game consoles, all of which support a digital ecosystem that are increasingly moving in the direction of all digital sales and subscription models. The capabilities of digital distribution should mean that access to thousands of titles from the past generations of gaming should be trivial, much as is currently the case for books, films, music, and more. But as many of you know, this just is not the case. So, one of the big points of this is the Video Game History Foundation conducted a study in 2023 where they took a sample set of classic game platforms and researched whether or not the games from those libraries were still available in the marketplace in some form or another. Could be like a digital release, could be a compilation, could be maybe a remaster, but in some form. The findings found that 87% of games were unavailable for purchase in a way that directly benefited the developers or publishers of those titles, and were instead only available on the secondary market on original hardware, which in some cases are unreliable or cost prohibitive. To make matters worse, while libraries are able to digitally lend books and films and music, because video games are software, libraries can only provide on-site access. So, who can I shake my fist at for this? Well, that would be the ESA. So, the Entertainment Software Association, they are a 501c5 nonprofit organization, which makes them a nonprofit labor organization. They're based right here in Washington, D.C., and pretty much every major game publisher, or at least their American counterpart, is affiliated with them. They are also responsible for both the now defunct E3 Expo and the ESRB ratings board. Also, this past October, after a 3-year process of petitioning the United States Copyright Office to provide an exemption to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act to provide the same exemption for digital lending as books, music, movies, and more, the ESA, quote, declared that they would never support remote game access for research purposes under any conditions. Phil, did I see you coming? Yes. Hi, Phil. Hi. This Phil. Thank you for your service. Keep fighting the good fight. So, what's the big deal? For the sake of being thorough, let's put this in other terms. Let's put this in terms of another creative medium, film. Let's say you want to watch the classic 1997 science fiction action comedy, The Fifth Element. Great movie. Wait, you know what? I'm going to side tangent here for a second. Who has not seen The Fifth Element? Rectify that immediately. The Fifth Element is one of those movies where you watch it for the first time and you're like, yo, that was really good. You want to watch it again? And then you watch it again twice in a row. It's so much fun. All right, so if old movies were like old video games, you couldn't just hop on Amazon and grab a DVD or a Blu-ray for $10, $20 if you want to be bougie and get a 4K Blu-ray digital combo pack, or just rent it for $4.49 on Amazon. Or, look on Netflix, look on one of the various other apps that are out there. There's a whole bunch of ways of accessing, this content now. So you can't do that. No, you have to go on eBay or Facebook Marketplace or, God forbid, Craigslist in order to track down a used copy on VHS. Does anybody not know what VHS tapes are? Okay. Defunct technology. You had to go and get a VHS copy for like $50 or $60, and then you'd have to go to Goodwill, Salvation Army, or Savers and buy an old, used, dirty VHS player with no remote and no guarantee that it works. And finally, really, if you want to be really technical, you would also need to go and track down an old CRT television while hopefully avoiding paying anywhere between like $100 and like $300 by someone who knows what they got. Again, no, I know what I got is like you see that on Craigslist all the time. Just that specific phrase. Again, possibly without a remote, which in some cases you would need to access important functions of the television. Like we're kind of used to this now because like modern televisions really only have like one little like function button at the bottom, and maybe a power button like as a physical button. Old TVs typically had buttons on them, but in a lot of cases, you might be able to change like the volume and the channel and maybe the input, but sometimes not even the input button was on the television, which means if you buy some TVs, you have to go and find the remote. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck on channel 3, and you can't plug your PS2 in and then switch to that input. You're going to be out of luck. And all because you just wanted to re-experience a movie you wanted to watch from when you were younger. Most of you already know this, but these are the obstacles in place if you want to play titles from older game consoles. No other major medium is like this. Not film, not music, not books. So, how should we feel about this? Disappointed. Very disappointed. Gary Oldman is fantastic in everything, by the way. But why is it like this? Why is it that 9 out of 10 games are no longer available in the marketplace? Why is it that you can't purchase them in a way that financially benefits the original developers or publishers? Why is it in some cases you simply cannot reasonably buy them at all due to them being financially unattainable or as a result of never having had a physical release? Obviously, we still value them. Like, if you want to play Little Samson, like legally play Little Samson for the original Nintendo, that's like a couple $1,000 game. You have to get a physical copy of the game and an actual Nintendo. Like, if you download a ROM of Little Samson, you're gonna be fine. But like legally, you have to have the actual physical game. It's still protected under copyright. So a big part of it is likely the advancement of technology, with the constant emphasis on more detailed graphics, higher frame rates, and more realistic lighting. A lot of people don't want to play old sprite-based games. A lot of people don't want to play old low-poly games, particularly at their native resolutions and frame rates. I must admit, I sometimes find it really hard to go back to early 3D polygonal games on the PlayStation, the N64, the Saturn. At last year's MAGFest, I presented a panel about Armored Core, and replaying the original gen Armored Core games on the PS1 to prepare was kind of rough. Like, those games like can really like chug in some spots. Like, their frame rate is kind of rough. But while audience trends and publishers' priorities are probably a major factor, the fact remains that these games were developed for specific hardware, and therein lies the problem. If you were unaware, often when you're playing a classic game in a remaster or a compilation or on something like the Nintendo Switch Online service, you're not playing the game's native code. You're playing an emulation of that original hardware written for the current hardware. While 80% of classic games are unavailable in the marketplace, a similarly high percentage of game source code is also unavailable. And by that, I mean the original developers didn't archive it. And has since been lost or misplaced. It's absolutely wild to think that a game as like important as Super Mario Brothers would be just lost. But that is the reality of game preservation. There are some folks out there going so far as to go through companies' old like paper archives and the like, trying to hunt down old like usable printouts of source code. And others reverse engineering the source code from ROMs or ISOs, but both processes are difficult and time consuming. It's kind of like if you've got like a file that you've like archived with like WinZip or WinRAR or 7-zip, and then just like lost the ability to unzip it. You know, you basically take the game source code and flatten it, compile it down into that image, but it's basically just like encrypted in a way. You have to reverse engineer it. There is a Melee decompilation project that has decompiled 25% of the game's source code. 3 years ago, they were at 5%. So the passion of that fan base and the time spent thus far should tell you how time-consuming reverse engineering a game is. Okay, so is there anything else to be bad about? Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So, publishers moving towards a digital future, and many of GameStop's business practices are in effect a self-perpetuating problem. GameStop weaponizes customers' fear of missing out against them in order to sell pre-orders. Then they deliberately understock key titles to limit the overall amount of product on the market, because they are the only specialty retail chain of video games. So because their end goal is to minimize the sale of new product, where the publisher earns the majority of the purchase cost, and maximize used sales, where the original publisher earns nothing. In response to this, publishers now incentivize digital sales with various digital and early access bonuses. As a result, fewer physical copies enter circulation, and digital copies are married to individual users' accounts. And those will get wiped in the event that a system is resold. They should get wiped if they get resold in order to protect user information. most used game shops and sellers should do this to protect your user data. Also, a different but somewhat related problem is that GameStop is known to have destroyed a significant amount of game hardware in the process of managing and merchandising product. In particular, they are known to have destroyed a substantial amount of DS cases and manuals. So if you like collecting DS games, you have them to thank for that. Another consideration is delisted games without physical releases. There is no legal way for you to play these games anymore. One specific example is Konami's Rebirth series of WiiWare titles. They have all been archived, but legally, there is no way for you to play these games. They're not on Steam, they're not on PSN, they're not on Xbox Live. There's no way for you to play these games. Currently, anyways. Which is crazy because they have just recently put out both a Contra compilation and a Castlevania compilation, but they did not include either of those games. And Gradius has its fans, but it's not like people are crazy about the way they are for the other things. So, anybody remember MechWarrior 2? As of right now, legally, your only option to play the classic mech sim is to purchase a secondhand copy and either build an era-appropriate box with DOS support or run the game through an emulator like DOSBox. Again, you can't legally play this game unless you buy a physical copy of it. So, at this point, it's worth mentioning that there's also a growing list of games that have been made open source. This does not necessarily mean that they've been released into the public domain, but some are. And regardless, either their engines or their content are legally available under certain conditions. For example, if you remember the puzzle platformer VVVVVVV, the creator released the game's source code. They retained the intellectual rights to the game, but the engine and its code are open source. So if you want to take it and reskin it and iterate it on it and make your own version of it with a different name and so forth, different graphics, you can do that, provided you provide the attribution under the licensing terms. You can do that. In the United States, for works created after 1978, protection lasts for the life of the offer plus 70 years, which means, hypothetically, if somebody entirely self-published a game for the Atari 2600 in 1979 and then immediately dropped dead, then the absolute earliest we could see that work enter the public domain would be 2049. But for all intents and purposes, video games that we know and play nowadays or over the past 20, 30 years will not really enter the public domain in our lifetime. So it's an immediate problem. There are certain works that have entered the public domain both in terms of code and content. However, at this point, they would have to have been released either by their original rights holders or by some other technical error. Famously, The Night of the Living Dead entered the public domain as the result of a technical error. So this leads me to the concept of abandonware. What this means is that there is where a copyright is held by a publisher or legal entity but no longer exists, or no longer exists in a capacity to enforce its copyright, or no longer cares to. It's a fairly murky area. There are websites that curate lists of abandonware and provide them free to download, but it's a very gray area. Abandonware is not a legal definition. It's not legal to pirate a work deemed abandoned. So if you go to abandonware.com or whatever it is, you're still violating the law. What we need is a nonprofit organization in this space to investigate individual works and facilitate their rights holders in releasing their works into the public domain, or at least making them open source. So I'm a big fan of the side-scrolling mech game Ranger X on the Sega Genesis. They did actually release it on the Sega Genesis Mini 2, but now that's out of print. So there's no legal way to buy that game unless you buy a secondhand copy of that mini console or a secondhand copy of the game. Somebody must still own the rights to that game, but they're not going to do anything with it. So could you please just let us have it? Alternatively, we would need abandonware to be made a legal provision, but I imagine this would be extremely difficult because it would have far-reaching ramifications for copyright protection. Like, how often does somebody have to reprint a film or a book to maintain their copyright? You know, like if 20 years go by and you don't want to publish a book, like, you know, so the question is like, what is the middle ground? Yet another consideration is the very nature of digital sales. Typically, but not always, when you, quote, buy or purchase a digital game, what you are actually purchasing is an indefinite license to that game. That license can often be revoked at any time for any reason. So, anecdotally, Minecraft. A friend gifted me a copy of Minecraft a while back. But at that time, Mojang, the developer of Minecraft, was owned by Microsoft, as they are still owned by Microsoft. They used to have their own Mojang servers, and at some point a couple years ago, they transferred all the player accounts from the Mojang servers to the Windows Live servers. Technically, you had to opt into it to have your account moved from the Mojang servers to the Microsoft servers to maintain your license to the game. My emails for that went to my promotions tab. You want to know how many unread emails I have in my inbox? Thousands. I have tens of thousands of emails in my promotions tab because we're just constantly bombarded with information, and in my opinion, that's not a reasonable way. I've tried to like, hey, Microsoft support, I didn't get this notification. That's not really fair. You own that company. You own that company then. But again, you have an indefinite license to that game, and they can take it away from you at any time, and they don't have to give it back. Unless you like really complain really loud and angrily, maybe they'll bend over backwards, but they don't have to. Some progress, if you want to call it that, is certain jurisdictions are requiring publishers to be more transparent about the terms of their digital sales. For example, January 1st, California's Digital Marketplace Law AB 2426 went into effect. It requires that quote, sellers must explicitly state if a digital good is being offered under a license agreement, ensuring that terms such as buy or purchase do not mislead customers into the consumers about the nature of the rights they are obtaining. Additionally, it requires, quote, affirmative customer acknowledgement. Before completing a purchase, customers must acknowledge their understanding that they are acquiring a license, not ownership. So I guess that's progress. Title updates. So title updates are a big like, they're going to be a big problem soon, fairly soon. So you can't, so like, okay. Title updates, you know, patches, bug fixes, quality of life improvements. You know, as the game, you know, sometimes you buy a game and like the day that you buy it, you have to update it because from when the game was pressed onto disc and when it actually physically gets into your hands, they keep working on the game and they fix things. Games like Aliens, Colonial Marines were famously like just broken when they came out. And they kept working on it and they fixed it. Still not a good game, but they improved some things about it. But if you buy that game 30 years from now, will you have access to the title updates? Right now, this kind of mainly applies to things like, we're most concerned about the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360. You can no longer buy new games through those services, but you can still re-download them. You can still access their title updates. But long term, those are coming from a server somewhere. So when that server is no longer online, how are you going to access that? And is there going to be a reasonable method for you to get those quality of life improvements that make the game playable in some cases? Otherwise, you have to take your console and you have to homebrew it, and then you have to get the title from an unauthorized dump of the titles. And then you have to use utility to flash it to a USB drive and then install it manually on your console. Which, you know, For some of us, it's like, oh yeah, I'm really into that kind of stuff. But for a lot of people, that's not a reasonable thing. Like if you're talking about the Xbox 360, you have to physically modify it, like at the hardware level. You have to like jump some things with some wire. So that's not a reasonable thing to expect people to do 20, 30 years from now. But that's what you're going to have to do unless they have some kind of long-term support for it. Also, your disk is a licensed proxy. Couple weeks ago, I just was like, you know what? I want to play some Halo Infinite. Just pop it in, play some campaign. Oh, how naive I was. Halo Infinite is an 85 gigabyte required install just to play the campaign. Okay? You know how much a standard Blu-ray holds typically? It's up to 50 gigabytes. There are triple and quadruple layer games, but it's not one of them. That whole disk, that whole game image is on a server. So there's no game code on some disks. And while I'm confident that Halo Infinite being a major title means that you're going to be able to play that game for a long period of time, what about other games that are basically just a license on a disk, where you're downloading the entirety of the game from a server? Will you be able to play that game 30 years from now? Probably not. Possibly not. Because, again, it's just a license on a disk. So, you have a majority of games absent from the marketplace, a decrease in physical copies as a result of both digital sales and reselling, an increase in titles without a physical release, a future without ownership. Well, that sucks. What can I do? First, I'm going to tell you about what you legally can do, and then we'll talk about what you can morally do. So, what can I legally do? Well, I'd like to say contact the Library of Congress or its Copyright Office to give them your feedback. But I've actually worked there. Not there, but like downstairs from there. I answered the phones for like 8 months at the Library of Congress. Their phone lines are jammed all day long, from when they open to when they close, all day, constantly. It sounds miserable. So, I also used to work with guys that used to work in congressional offices, 20-year-old interns, 21-year-old interns. Their job was to take and read an entire letter and then, all right, the issue is such and such, and they are in favor for it. And then they would just open up an Excel document and they would put +1. That's it. That your impassioned speech about a particular issue would just boil down to +1. And I was like, okay, cool. So they're taking those metrics. Are they doing anything with them? In your 8 months or whatever that you were there, how often did they actually say, hey, yo, what was the sentiment on this particular issue? And he was like, they never did. He was just basically there to like just read +1, read +1, and then just save it to a drive somewhere, and that's it. So very nihilistic, but like that's kind of like democracy. So, gotta do some other things. Stop supporting GameStop. Full stop. They are a failing company, and I am of the opinion that they do not deserve your patronage because they ultimately do more harm than good for the video game industry. And other companies will fill the void left behind should they finally go out of business. Like they've lost, like from their peak, they have lost more than half their retail locations in the last, I don't know, 10 years? Buy new. While there's a lot to be concerned with how game development is currently funded, buying new at least contributes to the financial stability of game development and game studios. Many studios find themselves shuttered, not just because a game didn't break even, but simply for underperforming. And used sales absolutely play a part in that. A really good book to read about this is Jason Schreier's Press Reset. It's all about the volatility of the game industry, and some of the stories in it are like absolutely wild. A lot of them are like about projects that were in debt, like they just did not like meet things, but they also talked about games that They broke even. They made money. It just was not enough to meet the exponential demands from game publishers because they. Yeah, absolutely. They talk about BioShock. They talk about oh my God, there's some wild stories in that book. It's a really, really good read. Press Reset by Jason Schreier. He has also written, I think, Press Start to Continue, which is all about burnout in the game industry. Also a really good read. And he's also written a book specifically called Play Nice about Blizzard and their history. Haven't read it yet, but I just apparently only read video game history now. Also, not related to this, but Masters of Doom, about the history of id Software, really good. You can breeze through that in like a week. It's so good. Anyway, buy physical. While a publisher may earn a higher profit per unit from a digital sale, a physical copy more often means you legally own the software. You also have the means to both lend it to a friend and to resell it when you no longer want to have it in your collection. Don't pre-order. Don't pre-order. While I realize it can be difficult to overcome that fear of missing out or that sense of completion, because of pre-order bonuses, but stop pre-ordering. We should stop incentivizing these manipulative tactics by publishers. Sure, they may give you a fun bit of additional in-game content, but all too often you're sacrificing your ownership, particularly if you're buying it digitally, of the title, and contributing to a future where games are increasingly incomplete upon release. Often they're just like a cool skin for a gun or a cool dance or whatever, but there are bits of content of the game. There is experiential content of the game that you will never have access to because you pre-ordered, because you keep supporting pre-orders. So, not guilting you, but don't pre-order. Stop pre-ordering. And support compilations and remasters whenever they come out. Like if you really love the Castlevania series, and you don't want to have to go and get an NES, a Super Nintendo, a Genesis, a PlayStation 1, or grab the Castlevania compilation. If you never played the Ratchet and Clank games, but they do in a remaster of them, pick it up. Show that you still care about these legacy titles. And while I'm saying buy physical, they do also make some games, from their back catalogs available digitally. And I would say in this case, yes, it's okay. Just show them that you still care about these games in a financial sense. If they don't understand now from all the Let's Plays and the guides and everything that people have been writing over the last 30 years about every single individual game under the sun, if they haven't figured out from all that content that people care about this shit, they are only going to listen to a financial bottom line. But there are some slightly better places to buy some of these old games. There is Humble Bundle and GOG. GOG does more DRM-free game digital releases than Humble Bundle, but they both provide some amount of DRM-free stuff. And in particular, Humble Bundle does a lot of charity-oriented sales and packages. And I would say they're probably both worth, supporting. I've gotten some really good groups of even just books from Humble Bundle about things you should have learned in high school, like financial literacy and how to fix things. And they had I got a pack of 60 books about all kinds of things, including camping and how to identify plants. It's just things you should have learned as an adult. Probably the best thing you can do is help support the efforts of folks like the Video Game History Foundation or the Electronic Frontier Foundation, organizations that are actively fighting for your digital rights. I know it's easier said than done, but had the Video Game History Foundation been successful in having an exemption made for digital lending of games, that would have been a significant step forward in solving these issues. So, we could try again. We could try again, right? Yes. We are nothing but not persistent. So, what else can I do? So this is just my own personal opinion, but while it may not be legal to download a ROM or an ISO of a game protected by copyright, if it is not possible to obtain a game in a way that financially benefits the game's publisher, developer, or rights holder, it is morally permissible to obtain that game via unauthorized methods. Again, you would give them money if you could, but you can't. So, I believe it is morally permissible to obtain it by unauthorized methods. Again, this is just my personal opinion. I'm not saying you should break the law, but if you do, it is my opinion morally permissible to do so. So, there are also emulators. You know this. There's emulators. And many of them will allow you to run a game directly from the original disc. It's a little bit more complicated in some areas, like GameCube discs are a special proprietary mini DVD, and you can only run them on certain drives. But you can always rip them from a Wii and then use those on your computer or whatever. But you can run many legitimate retail copies of games on your computer rather than having to track down and try and find a working original Xbox that hasn't had its clock capacitor leak all over the board and ruin it. Pro tip, if you have an original Xbox and you haven't had its original clock capacitor removed, find somebody that can remove it from you before it leaks and ruins your system forever. There are also cartridge adapters, and it is of course possible to legally dump a ROM or an ISO to a drive or a card, much in the same way that you would rip a music CD to your computer or your phone or whatever. And some of them have, controller adapters built into them. Like I have one of these. This one plays SNES and Genesis and Super Famicom and Mega Drive, and it has two controller ports for both the Super Nintendo and Genesis controllers. And then you can just run them directly into an emulator. You don't technically have to, if you download a ROM of a Genesis game, you're probably going to be fine. But if you absolutely legally want to do it, you can do this. It's possible. There are also various methods of getting certain disk-based systems to read CDRs, DVDRs, and et cetera. You've got EverDrives for cartridge-based systems where you can take an SD card with whatever ROMs that you have, whether you're legally dumped ROMs, probably not legally obtained, but whatever. You can, put an SD card into an EverDrive and put it in your system and play, again, if you download a copy of Little Samson, you're probably going to be fine. There's also ODEs, and if you're not familiar with an ODE, what that is an optical drive emulator. Basically, it's like you take the whole optical part of the game console out and you put in an SD card adapter and run some custom software, and that lets you run game images directly from a typically SD card. But there are also various methods of getting certain disk-based systems to read CDRs, DVDRs, and so on. A big thing is homebrew and soft mod methods. Famously, the Wii is very easy to homebrew. The PS2 is a little bit complicated to homebrew, but the good thing about the PS2 is that you don't have to alter any of the onboard code in its memory. One of the considerations in homebrewing a system is sometimes you have to physically modify it, as is the case for an Xbox 360. But in the case of a Wii, you're actually injecting code into the onboard memory of the system. So, something I see often is people homebrewing their Vitas to play PS2 games, and then they do it the wrong way, and they brick the Vita, and then there's nothing that can be done about it, ever. It's just bricked, unless you want to take the whole thing apart and desolder some very, very tiny things from it and replace them, or it's not reasonable to fix some of these things. But it's possible to brick your Wii, your Wii U, your 3DS, your Vita in the process of doing this. But it's possible in order to play ISOs and ROMs of things that you just can't get. Like Def Jam Vendetta, Def Jam Fight for New York is like a $200 game now. Silent Hill 2 is over $200 now. It's Haunting Ground, Kuon, some of these games are $500, $600, $700. There's Panzer Dragoon Saga for the Saturn is $1,000 game now. I remember years ago, it was like $300 and people were like, "Nope, that's way too expensive." Yeah, just $1,000 games. But another thing is FPGA, which is field programmable gate array. Contrary to, so like when you play a game in an emulator, you're running Windows, and on top of Windows, you're running a emulator, which is another program, just like you would run Photoshop or Chrome or whatever, that then runs software. You're not running the actual game code, you're running an extra layer. But that's just software imitating. An FPGA is hardware imitating. You've got various chips on the board of the device that are imitating the original hardware of the console, so that way it can take the disk or take the ROM or the ISO or whatever and run it without, like, basically, you know, in real time, the way it should work theoretically, exactly the way it was originally. There are things like the Mister, which is like a DIY kit that has multiple inputs and outputs. There are also specific companies that are releasing specific products. Like, this is the one for the N64 that Analog is coming out with at some point soon, if they haven't already. But in some ways, this is the future, because your systems, like your N64 is kind of a tank. Like, you can drop a cinder block on it and it'll probably be fine, but it's not going to last forever. You know, you've got bit rot, you've got various other kinds, you've got corrosion of pins, you've got oxidation, like all these things are going to happen. Capacitors are going to leak, your systems are going to go bad, they're not going to last forever. You know, like you go to your local game store and I guarantee you up in the rafters, they have like 100 dead PS2s because they're just, optical media is very fragile. There's lots of moving parts. So that's probably the future, is these consoles that recreate the original hardware to play the media, but also the media is potentially finite in terms of its lifespan. They say something about like discs having like a 50-year lifespan, cartridges having like an 80-year lifespan, maybe. But it all depends on how well you take care of it, conditions, humidity, whether or not you breathed on the disc to then polish it on your shirt, and all that bacteria is now on the disc. So, got 15 minutes. So, does anybody have any deep burning questions they'd like to pick my brain? Let's start with you, because I can hear you probably best.
So I am fully aware what I'm about to say is being extremely pedantic.
That's okay.
But
It's MAGFest.
have an entire session about the fact that other forms of media, like movies, books, music, stuff like that, don't have as much lost media as
Correct.
video games do.
Yep.
But I think with movies and television, they still do, and it's happening a lot more frequently. Like the fact that there are games that made it all the way through, literally edited, they were ready to go to theaters, and then a company like Warner Brothers was saying, nope, we're just not going to release it.
Oh yeah, I'm really mad about the Alien vs. Predator CG series that was completely finished, and then the Disney acquisition, like, you know, of Fox, basically put that, like, shelved that into their back catalog.
Or just the fact that, like, with Max, that there are a bunch of shows that, like, were originally on HBO when it was still a TV channel that you now can't find
Right.
anywhere.
I'm pretty. I don't know a whole lot about that specific topic, but I would imagine part of it is possibly just the fact we know a lot more about things now. Like, information exchange is so much more active. But like my view of it is, like, you know, before things, like way back in the day when like VHS was the way that you watch video, and like you couldn't just have like a box set of 20 VHS tapes with an entire season of a show. You know, they would release certain shows in their entirety on VHS, but you'd have a whole wall just for that one series. Whereas like now you can get like a Blu-ray or DVD set of that whole thing. Like it didn't used to be that you could have access to entire seasons of shows, you know, like 20 years ago. Like now it's just a trivial thing. You can just hop on Netflix and watch like all of Lost. Whereas like 20 years ago, if you wanted to watch like all of MASH, you'd have to set your VCR and record it on reruns, and hopefully they air it in some kind of order that like it makes sense if they actually re-air the entire thing. So I overall, we've gotten better with access to back catalogs of television and movies because it's so much easier to release that stuff now. Like we have Netflix, we have Amazon Prime, and so forth. Absolutely, definitely, like a thing to be concerned about. Like again, AVP CG series, I'm mad about it. It's a shelved thing that people want to watch.
My only reason for bringing it up is the fact that I feel like, yes, video games and our ability to be able to play some of them is a lot further along than movies and television, but I do feel like we probably will have a very similar situation, and it will catch up to at some point.
The good thing about that is, though, that like film is an older medium that's been around for longer, so like there's going to be more and more things entering the public domain during our lifetime, which is nice. Depends on whether or not those things are relevant or not. Like Tintin just entered the public domain. The original Mickey Mouse entered the public domain. Popeye, Batman, the original versions of these characters. So you don't have access to like Harley Quinn or Clayface, but you have access to the original of these things. Beanie.
Yeah, so I did want to play off of what he said, actually. Like, Warner Brothers especially is really bad about that because they actually canceled a full movie, I think like 1 or 2 years ago
They've
now.
done like it 3 times.
Well, yeah, no, they've had multiple products, like Caillou versus Taxi is the big one that a lot of people were upset about. Exactly. Because, like, that was a movie starring Wile E. Coyote, and he was going to be suing the acting corporation. It was like a Good Roger Rabbit kind of situation. Warner Brothers had that entire thing finished, they just canceled it. They decided, you know what, we're not going to release this, we're not going to pay our artists basically residuals because we're writing it off. So it sucks for the artists, and it also sucks that we don't get to see that. And there's also like a Batgirl movie. I don't really care about that, but they can like some Scoob sequel. But yeah, just a ton of projects like that. And they've also taken a lot of stuff off of that, especially like a lot of Cartoon Network shows aren't there anymore. Like Courage the Cowardly Dog. You can't watch that on Netflix.
Yeah. So for you at the back who might not have heard the whole exchange, similar concerns about that, like what we're talking about here, but within like film and television, and that there are a noteworthy amount of stuff within those industries that are also like lost media or unreleased media that like, how do we solve that problem? Let's go with you on the right over by the speaker. Green.
Actually, I was just wondering, did you know that the reason that re-release that they did was Silent Hill 2 and 3 on PS3 and Xbox 360? The reason why those games are like that is because Konami lost the source code for both those games.
Yes. So Silent Hill 2 and 3 remaster on PS3 plays badly because it doesn't play off of they didn't have access to the original source code. Similarly, I believe they also lost the source code to Zone of the Enders 1 and 2 when they re-released those, which is why those games run so poorly, because they are trying to emulate the PlayStation 2's hardware on the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, which is why that game ran at 60 frames per second on the PS2 and only ran at like 24 to 30 frames on those systems because, yeah, they're running an emulator to do that. They're running an extra step. So, yes. Purple hair. Purple wig.
At this very convention, there is at least one vendor selling reproduction cartridges of NES, SNES, and SNES.
Boo.
Yeah, so some of these are homebrews, some of these
Yes. Fan hacks, fan translations.
Yeah, direct ports of either European or just very rare games. What's stopping companies from being able to do this for all games that exist in cartridge form to preserve them?
When it comes to translations and fan hacks, particularly of games that are no longer in print, you can make the argument that they fall under fair use, which is not a law, it's just a protection. But outright reproductions of games, it's illegal. If you have concerns, there is a table in the marketplace where Marketplace operates, and you can talk to them. But yes, I know there's plenty of retro game shops that sell fan translations and fan hacks and reproductions of things. There's one that just opened in White Marsh that's doing that right now. Gwen. Yeah, I wish there was. So the question is like, if you download a copy of something, what is a good way of like saying, hey, thanks to the original like the original developer of that thing? Buy a T-shirt, maybe. I'm not really sure. Buy if you really really love Bungie and you download a copy of Marathon, the original Marathon, also get the actual new Marathon when it comes out, I guess. Yeah, just in whatever way, just support the original creators in their current endeavors, I suppose. But you know, it'd be nice if they just threw up a PayPal account and be like, "Hey, just tip us here," or a Ko-fi, I guess. That's all I really got. Right in front.
How does, this is a copyright law, how does Death Plus Everything work when a lot of these copyright holders are corporations where the original developers no longer claim to be part of this company?
I'm not a legal person. Someone else could probably explain this. But it's kind of more about what I was talking about with abandonware. You know, what's the Mitt Romney thing of corporations are people, my friend? I do not know the specific legal answer to that question, but I imagine it would operate in a very similar capacity that the company that is the registrant of the copyright would. I don't know, can I guess? Well, actually, sorry to say, I do not know the answer to that question. You got a black shirt with some orange and some red on it.
With older media, if I don't know exactly how to word it because I don't know if something for it exists, but I know there's always people like there was an old abandonware. I remember seeing an old forum post where someone they're like, "There's this really weird cartridge. What is it?" And someone's like,
Proto-
"Take it out. It needs to be dumped." To
pro-
conserve."
yeah, prototypes.
But like, what do you do when you have media that you don't need anymore, and there, like, is there like a main place to send it on to be preserved if it's an older game?
So the question is like hypothetically, I found a prototype.
Yes.
Uh,
Say if someone
like hypothetically find a and what you're referring to is like if you're not aware, if you take apart a prototype cartridge for a game, there's a ROM cartridge or a ROM chip, and typically they're just flat all the way at the top, but typically in a prototype cartridge, there's a little like optical window where the data is flashed onto the chip, and sometimes it has a little sticker over top of it, sometimes it doesn't. So if you open up the cartridge and then take a photo of it with a flash, you can destroy the data on that chip in the prototype. But the real realistic straight answer is once something is on the internet, it is always on the internet. So if you just hypothetically find a piece of lost media and you cannot find it on the internet, you just put it somewhere on the internet, and then it is there forever. If you find a prototype for a game, don't sell it, just release it. Like send it to some place like Video Game History Foundation. Say, hey, I found a undiscovered prototype for a game. Send it to them. There are reputable people like that, do this, that they can just, if you don't have the hardware, they can do it for you. I would just, hypothetically, if I found one, I would just contact Video Game History Foundation and say, hey, I found this. Or you could probably buy a game cartridge adapter for like $20-$30, open it up in File Explorer, and then grab the bin file out of it, make a copy of it, and then send it to or you could put it onto archive.org. That is a good repository for these sorts of things as well. And I think that's about all the time we have time for. Again, if you want to email me, contact me, ask me about anything like, hey, what was that book you mentioned? Or you want a source for something, send me an email or whatever. Again, please leave feedback for anything you see this weekend in Guidebook. It helps us out and let us know whether or not people are enjoying things. Don't die, drink water. Enjoy the rest of your MAGFest.